Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Welcome to See You on the Weekend. This is an ongoing series of lectures featuring some of the most exciting and cutting-edge work of CU Boulder's world-class faculty from across disciplines and fields. We're really excited to have you here today. This is the first time we've been back having an in-person dimension to this meeting after all the time of COVID pandemic lockdowns and related things. So this is sort of our launch of this event as an in-person event. We also have a hybrid dimension to it. So there are folks who are attending online, and we will try and incorporate both the distance audience as well as the folks in the room throughout the event. So today's lecture is titled America's Broken Political Process and the Path Forward. My name is David Means, and I will be functioning somewhat as a moderator. I'm the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which organizes and produces these events. And there's a few logistics that we'll talk about before we get started. Since we're doing this hybrid format, we appreciate your patience as we figure out some of the wrinkles. We'll get better at it as we go, I'm sure. And it enables us to include as many people as possible, as we have done over the last couple of years with our virtual events. We have 160 some registrants, I believe, for the online format. So even though you can't see them in the seats next to you, those of you who are in the room, they will be part of the discussion as well. So Professor Spencer will be incorporating some question and answer and discussion throughout the talk. Online attendees may submit questions throughout as they come to you. If you're viewing the lecture online, as those things do occur to you, please feel free to submit them. And I'm going to be up here at the front of the room and letting Doug know when we do have questions from the online audience, and we'll work those in. For those of you who are in the room, you can just raise your hand, and we'll have a couple of our staff who have microphones who will be able to come over so you can offer your contribution or your question into a microphone. That ensures that everyone in the room will be able to hear the question as well as Professor Spencer's answer. And the folks online will be able to hear it as well. So be sure to wait for that microphone to get to you before you speak to the rest of us. So let's see, for those who are online, this is probably pretty familiar to folks, but the Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A button down towards the bottom of your window. You can click on that, and that's how you can submit those questions, which will come to me. So let's see, I think I covered that stuff. The online version of this lecture is being recorded and will be made available on our website early this coming week. So you can access that at the website where you registered for this event. And a couple other things for those who are in the room, the bathrooms. If you haven't been in this building before, you go out to this lobby area to the south here, and you go out the doors and straight back, and you'll see some signage, and it's not too far away, but you can find the bathrooms back there. You may have already noticed we also have a table with some volunteers from the League of Women Voters of Boulder County. If you are interested in checking on your voter registration or registering to vote or finding out about resources they have for how you can find out about ballot initiatives, other issues. They have some great nonpartisan resources that will eventually be available online. Talk to them about that. It's relevant to our topic, and we're really glad that they were able to join us here today. Okay, am I missing anything important, those of you who know? I think we're good. Okay. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Jennifer Sullivan, who is the Assistant Dean for Strategic Initiatives at Colorado Law, to introduce today's esteemed speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a real treat and honor to be here. I have attended some of these in the past, and it really does feel good to be back in a room with folks at CU on the weekend. First, I want to extend my gratitude to the offices of the Chancellor and the Provost, as well as the Division of Continuing Education for funding CU on the weekend and making today's event possible. It truly is my honor to introduce my colleague at Colorado Law, Professor Doug Spencer. Although Professor Spencer has only been at the law school for a very short time, he has quickly established a reputation for being not only an extraordinary scholar and professor, but also colleague. And as proof of that, he this year was named Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research, which is a distinction that is normally reserved for much longer serving faculty. I call it a distinction. It is, but it comes with a great deal of work, which Doug happily and capably does. And I will say that perhaps unsurprisingly, given his area of research and interest, he is a person uniquely dedicated to the health and well-being of every institution and community that he seems to come into contact with. He has certainly made Colorado law a much better place to work, and I'm thankful to him for that. Professor Spencer is an election law expert whose research addresses the role of prejudice and racial attitudes in voting rights litigation, the empirical implications of various campaign finance regulations, and the way that election rules and political campaigns contribute to growing inequality in America. From 2013 to 2021, Professor Spencer was a professor of law and public policy at the University of Connecticut, and he has also held visiting professorships at Yale Law School and at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy Studies. Professor Spencer has worked as an expert witness in voting rights and campaign finance cases, and prior to teaching law, was a law clerk at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco, as well as an election monitor in Thailand for the Asian Network for Free Elections, and a researcher at the Pew Center on the state's military and overseas voting reform project. He is a frequent contributor to the press and runs a website called All About Redistricting, a fact that I didn't even know about until I researched him for today. Spencer holds a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California, Berkeley. He's also earned a JD at Berkeley Law, as well as an MPP at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He graduated from Columbia University magna cum laude in 2004 with a BA in philosophy. I know from having seen Professor Spencer speak before that you are in for a real treat today. He has a particular brilliance for explaining how current and historic election laws shape our democracy and how modern day political machinations and jurisprudence affect the right to vote. Please join me in welcoming Professor Doug Spencer to See You on the Weekend.
Shared? Is it?
No, I'm not. Oh, there.
Looking good. Okay. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Jen. Jen is my favorite colleague at the law school, and I would say that even if we were at a faculty meeting with all of my colleagues at the law school, not just because those doors are closed. So it's extra flattering to be complimented by somebody who I respect so much. If you are a student or a CU staff or a CU faculty member, welcome. If you are an alum who went to school here, welcome back. It's so good to see you. If you ended up in Boulder for other reasons and you didn't go to CU Boulder, I'm really sorry for you. But we are also very happy to see all of you here today. And I wish that we were here talking about something that didn't sound so depressing. And there's an element of this which has a negative connotation, and I'm going to walk through some of the ways in which our political process seems to not be functioning as well as it could be, and presumably not as well as those of you who decided to come today or watching online want it to be, or else we would be off enjoying this weather doing something else and basking in the happiness that we live in a functioning democracy and everything's well, and we have the privilege of riding our bike and going on a picnic. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So here we are in a room to diagnose some problems, introspect, I hope. And my goal is, at the very end of this, there is this title that says A Path Forward. And I wish that I had a silver bullet I could offer you. What I want to do is to give you a framework for thinking about some of the things that we can do. And I also want to hold up a mirror to each of you. As easy as it is to blame others, whether it's people in our family, whether it's people in Washington, D.C., people who live in this community or that community, there's a lot that each of us is not doing and that we could do better in terms of the way we're digesting information and the way that we see each other as human beings. And so some of this is going to get a little bit away from the law and more into a conversation about maybe what an academic would call sociology or relationship studies. I don't want to think about that for a minute. Now, as somebody who teaches constitutional law at the CU Law School, it's imperative, I think, it's part of the job description that I let you know that today, September 17th, is Constitution Day. The federal constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787 by the convention that had drafted the Constitution. So we're at 235 years, incredibly a long time. Hundreds and hundreds of constitutions around the globe have come and gone since our Constitution was ratified. And ours remains a steady hand, we think. And in fact, I'm going to come back to this and we're going to think about whether being such an old document is a good thing or not. The Constitution was ratified finally by the 9th state. It took 9 out of the 12 or the 13 states to ratify the Constitution in 1789 on March 9th. But today marks an anniversary of sorts about the US Constitution. And so you may see programming. Every institution that gets federal funding since President Eisenhower has had, I guess, some kind of requirement that they do a program related to the Constitution this week. So if you are on the website of events for CU at the law school or here on the main campus, you may see some events like that that talk about the Constitution. If that interests you, I encourage you to attend those events. Okay. This is boring. This is just a title slide to help you know where we're going. I've got a little thing here on the side that's going to let us know about how we're going. It's structured. This looks, I mean, I'm a professor and you're seeing this and now you're thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to lecture at me. I don't want to lecture at you. I do want to talk about some things, but I do welcome any questions that you have or anybody who's watching online who wants to submit a question. There's somebody monitoring the Q&A who's going to flag me down and I'm happy to pause at any point. I have probably 30 minutes worth of things if I just talked uninterruptedly, and we have 75 minutes. So there's plenty of time for us to engage in a discussion at any point. You don't have to wait until the end if you don't want. Okay. Why is our political process so broken? Now, the nice part about this talk is I don't have to set that up. There's no 5-minute, let me convince you that there's a breakdown in America's political process. I'm just going to presume we all understand that, and I'm going to ask a question. Why? Why is it the case? I presume if you're here, you accept the premise of this presentation. Some of this is baked into this document that I just spoke about in the Constitution. In part, the Constitution is not a democratic document. Now, it's interesting if you see the individuals who rebelled against England and drafted the Declaration of Independence, the language that they used. This was an oppressed people. They came to the United States across the sea to start a new life because they felt oppressed for all sorts of reasons, political reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons. And they drafted a document that said, all men are created equal. We're all children of God and we all share this space on an equal footing. 1776. Fast forward to 1787. Barely a decade later, the very same people drafting a document to dictate what our government will look like, this nation of equal people. But this group wasn't so oppressed anymore. They had some status, they had some land, they had won a war. And how quickly they forgot what it was like to be oppressed. How quickly they forgot how important it was to have a voice in government. So they structured a constitution that gave power to a very small group of people that looked like the people who wrote the Constitution and basically their family and friends. We have a constitution that says the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. What does that mean? This is where we understand the right to vote in our Constitution. It doesn't say you have the right to vote. It says each state gets to decide who's eligible to vote. And so whoever the state decides is eligible to vote for our lower house in the state legislature, those are the people that will have the right to vote. And that was 6% of the population in 1787. 6%. White men who owned property, who were adults, who paid taxes. 6% of the population. We can't even call ourselves a democracy as the United States without laughing at ourselves until at least 1965, when we passed the Voting Rights Act. Because that's a place where possibly we could say, at least on the books, we have rules that make it fair for everybody, with a few exceptions, children, maybe people with felony status. But generally speaking, our population has the ability to have a voice, women, people of color. 1965. At that point, it's plausible, I think, to call the United States a constitution. That's 50 years ago, not 235 years ago. You can imagine, had the Constitution granted voting rights to everybody, and then we had spent the last 235 years justifying restrictions. Okay, maybe my 7-year-olds shouldn't vote. I mean, some people think that kids should have a stronger voice than they do, but we could justify, is it 7, is it 12, is it 18? We'd start from 0 and work our way up. We've started in the opposite direction from a very small group of people, and we've had to justify expanding this. Are we gonna allow women to vote? Well, not for a long time. For a long time, women were property. And then even if women weren't formally property, we were pretty sure they were just gonna do what their husbands told them to do. So why would it be worth giving women a right to vote when they were so manipulated? Okay, finally, we get 1919, 1920. We've had to force this expansion. Article 1, Section 2 says the electors have this, this qualification, and this is who is eligible to vote at the time. We have ratified amendments to the Constitution that have expanded the right to vote, but not all of the amendments have expanded the right to vote. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 in the wake of the Civil War. And one of the concerns was, what about all these people who live in the Confederacy who are rejoining the Union but hate the Union? Yes, we've signed a treaty, we're forcing them to rejoin and reconstruct our country, but their states are only allowed to rejoin our Union if they sign on to the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment saying everybody is a citizen if they were born here, even if they were formerly enslaved, and the 15th Amendment, which said there's voting rights for everybody regardless of the color of your skin. But there's also a provision that people don't pay attention to in the 14th Amendment that says it's okay for the state to discriminate against you and withhold your voting rights, particularly if you were engaged in a rebellion or an insurrection. If you were part of the Confederacy and you don't believe that our country deserves to exist, it might be okay for a state to suppress your vote. That's baked into the Constitution. There's a side element of this I'll just flag that says you can't run for office if you engaged in an insurrection. You may have seen that in the headlines because there are lawyers trying to use that language of the 14th Amendment to prevent certain people related to January 6th from being eligible to run for office. But this is the separate part of the 14th Amendment that says it's okay to take away people's right to vote if they engaged in insurrection, comma, or other crime. Well, what does that mean, or other crime? The US Supreme Court in 1974 said, or other crime means you've committed a felony. So the Supreme Court has said states have the authority to take away your voting rights if you have a felony record, if you've been convicted of a felony. And states have different policies. Jen? What did you say for our audience?
Are there any cases that have interpreted the clause participation in rebellion?
Only recently has a court ruled that this is a clause that can be interpreted and that would apply to somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Madison Cawthorn. Madison Cawthorn was a representative in North Carolina that got the closest to being ruled ineligible by having a court interpret this. But the court didn't give us clear language that you had to be physically present, have ill intent or anything. So it's a very open framework. They've evaluated this language, but not given us a path forward. And the reason why in the Madison Cawthorn case, he was a representative of North Carolina, he lost his primary. And once he lost his primary election, the judges pulled out of the case and said, well, that dispute is moot. Politics took care of it for us. So we don't have a framework from courts that tell us what an insurrection is or isn't, whether there has to be violence, whether if participation includes you were personally violent or just witnessed violence. We don't know whether if you tell people at the podium, we should march down to the Capitol and fight like hell, and you incite the riot, if that's considered participating in the rebellion. But those are the questions before federal courts now. And by the end of this year, we should have some idea about how courts view this. but there's no consistent, clear framework on this quite yet.
I'm sorry, Doug, can I? We do have one comment from online, and it is a question of whether it would be possible to adjust your mic so that it's louder, maybe moving closer to you. No?
I'll try this. I've confirmed it's on at least. So I will try to speak even louder as if I'm not wearing a microphone. And yes, those watching online, if you're welcome to provide more feedback, and I'll try to adjust the microphone better if that needs to happen. All right, we've had an additional set of amendments that have expanded the right to vote. And the reason I'm talking about this is that our Constitution lacks a very clear statement about who gets the right to vote. We know a few ways that you can't discriminate against the right to vote. But that still doesn't say affirmatively that it exists as a fundamental right and isn't just some privilege of citizenship or privilege of some subset of citizens if they engage in virtuous behavior, like getting out of their house and going to register to vote and then talking to their neighbors and all these things that feel like they're restrictions on our ability to vote. The Supreme Court a long time ago spoke very glowingly about the right to vote in a case called Yickwo versus Hopkins. Here's almost our Supreme Court. I don't have a picture yet replacing Justice Breyer with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, but what does our Supreme Court have said about this? A long time ago, they said it's self-evident, it's obvious that voting is a fundamental right. In fact, it's the most fundamental right of all rights because it is preservative of all other rights. It's more fundamental than the right to free exercise of your religion. It's more fundamental than your right to own a gun because it is the crux of how those other rights gain power and find their footing in our society. But I put in parentheses, that's a long time ago, 1886. That's before the 14th Amendment that granted equality, or the 15th Amendment, which said you had the right to vote regardless of race. What has the Supreme Court said more recently? Well, I'll just preview. They're not very flowery about this. Here is an opinion from 2019 from the US Supreme Court in a case that had challenged some election restrictions in Arizona and claimed that the impact of those voting restrictions was falling most heavily on Black and brown citizens of Arizona who were voting. And the Supreme Court said, well, no, we are not burdening your fundamental right by requiring you to go to a certain place to vote, preventing people from helping you vote, for example. It's inconvenient maybe if you're not allowed to have somebody help you vote if you're disabled. But that's not really an infringement on your right. And so you see at the bottom here, it says mere inconvenience cannot be enough. But that's not what I want you to focus on. Like a good lawyer, I want you to look in the footnote of this opinion. This is an opinion written by Justice Alito. Justice Alito says there's a difference between openness and opportunity on the one hand, and the absence of inconvenience on the other hand. So let's just, for example, let's talk about this and compare voting rights to the other most fundamental right we have, which is taking a trip to a museum. Okay, sure. Let's suppose that an exhibit at a museum in a particular city is open to everyone free of charge every day of the week for several months. Some residents of the city have the opportunity to view the exhibit, may find it inconvenient for many reasons. Parking, you got to ride a bus, maybe it's going to be crowded, maybe you've got to do yard work, etc. Okay, and I'm just going to set aside the fact that Justice Alito thinks that voting is equivalent to visiting the museum on a weekend, which is such a privileged and fun thing to do for a very, very small segment of the population, maybe 6% of the population. What I want to point out is we would never see this language in a Supreme Court opinion about gun rights. Don't worry, it's just inconvenient. It's just inconvenient if you have to get a background check. It's just inconvenient if you need to get an extra certification before you can buy a silencer on your gun. We would never see this in a case about free exercise. It's just inconvenient that it's hard to go to church. We're really sorry that it's slightly inconvenient for you to exercise your religion. And I don't want to really speak about gun rights and religious rights. I just find it sad for somebody who's studying voting rights that we don't afford at least the same amount of protections for voting rights as other rights. The Supreme Court in 1886 would say we should provide even more voting rights than other rights, but at least let's make it at the same level. And the Supreme Court that exists now is not viewing voting in that way. Voting rights can be restricted in ways that we wouldn't tolerate otherwise. So all that means is that we don't now accept the proposition, or we can't once we've read this opinion, that voting rights are preservative of all other rights. It's such a powerful statement. It's beautiful language. I personally think that it's true, but that's not the case in our law. Right now, the law is it's okay to inconvenience people in this particular way, but not another way, which then sets us up to think, okay, it may not be that our Constitution is currently written and as currently interpreted by our Supreme Court in 2022 will be able to provide a robust protection of the right to vote. And hence, our political process gets broken just a little. We don't have the voices of everybody. Please, will you just wait 1 minute while a microphone comes to you, but I'd love to hear your question. And while we're waiting for this question, if somebody online is willing to send in a note on the Q&A, just confirming they can hear me, that would be very helpful.
So my question is, it seems if Alito's going to take this position, he's got to make some distinction between inconvenience and fundamental inaccessibility. You go through and you have people standing outside for 8 hours without water or bathroom facilities, and something like that. That's beyond inconvenience. Didn't he make any kind of provision for that?
No. It's a very simple answer. The answer is no. And I don't know what to make of this. I think there's something very, one of the concerns about the Supreme Court and its size and its lack of representation is that Justice Alito himself probably has never stood in line to vote more than 5 or 10 minutes. And that's not a critique on him. He's grown up in a community that luckily was committed to voting rights and provided many polling stations that were conveniently accessible, and he had a background that allowed him to own a car, whatever it took to make that happen. And this is a part for us of holding a mirror up to ourselves. It's really easy to point at Samuel Alito and say, that guy's out of touch. He's wealthy. He's never really thought about it. How could he have empathy? Well, you know, I just moved to Boulder a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. You can't move to Boulder County now unless you're pretty wealthy. And so people who live in this community share a lot of the same characteristics as Samuel Alito. And it's easy to say, well, yeah, he's really not putting the mirror up to himself and recognizing these inconveniences. How many inconveniences are we as a city or as a county willing to tolerate for equality? How do we bristle when we hear new proposals for housing or university this or taxes this? We have our own ways that we bristle in our own homes, and no one has to admit it here in public. I think part of this is people who have certain experiences in life view the world in a certain way. And our Supreme Court has 4 women on it. I think that's a really important fact that hasn't existed before. There's people of color on the court. That makes a difference. We see it. It allows that institution to have a little bit more, as a group, empathy. And no, on the technical front, Justice Alito has not given us a dividing line when something becomes so inconvenient that it becomes a burden. But in the law, that's a very common thing to do for the Supreme Court. They leave it for a lower court judge to say, on this spectrum of inconvenience, at what point do I think it's a burden? When does it become unreasonable? And so he's just left this for lower courts. And he said, in this case, I find that these restrictions are still on the spectrum of unreasonable, of reasonable inconvenience. They haven't crossed that line. And so now all the lower court judges have to adjust their settings about when they'll think something is too inconvenient. So that's not, I wouldn't hold that too much against Alito, because he's not doing something that looks nefarious or unlike law, like I would argue he did in the Dobbs case. Here, at least he's doing something that looks legal, but it also speaks to us about the views of the court on what voting means. And it's not a protected right like other rights that we have.
So Professor Spencer, let me interrupt. Some folks responded to your question about the volume
Yes.
online, and they several folks said that they can hear you fine. I just want to suggest for folks who are online who are still having any trouble with the level of the volume, there's a button you can click that has the letters CC. And that's closed captioning, in which case you can see the transcript, which is happening live, and that might help. And we're also having a tech assist up here too.
All right. Yeah, stay here and make it work. I'll keep talking. All right, if the Constitution won't solve this problem for us, and the Supreme Court won't help us bridge the gap between the Constitution's frailties, and I can tell already it just got better, thank you, and what our society needs. And one other thing, let me point out about our Constitution, it's baked in certain institutions in certain ways, like that every state gets one representative and 2 senators, no matter what. When the country was founded, the difference between Virginia, which was the most populated state, and Delaware, which was the least populated state, was about 10 times difference. Now, the difference between California and Wyoming is 75 times different. And let me just say, that's not the worst that it's ever been. In 1900, the population of New York was 175 times greater than the population of Nevada. And it probably won't also surprise you, for those of you who understand a little bit of American history, that in the early 1900s, there was major reform to our political process because it had become so broken. This isn't the first time we found ourselves in a situation like this, where the progressive era came through and we added direct election of senators, and we added rules about corporate power, and we added rules about corruption and antitrust and people capturing the system. So as we get closer to that again, we can look back maybe and learn some lessons. I see a hand here in the back, yes.
So you talked about lower courts and how the Supreme Court is passing it on, but where do the states' rules? We've seen all these different states that come in with different rules. What's the process there for states to be making rules as well?
Yeah, so there's a question about using state courts or state institutions as well. This is amazing. So your intuition is exactly right. This is actually one of the things that I'm going to talk about in my path forward. Why do we go to the US Supreme Court to solve our problems? Why do we think 9 people are going to resolve our problems when we live in an amazing state in Colorado? And if you think your voting rights have been infringed, why don't you go to a Colorado court and say, the Colorado Constitution guarantees free and fair elections? The US Constitution doesn't do that. So if this rule violates my right to vote by making elections not fair and not free, why not have it struck down by a state court for violating the state constitution? People who studied state constitutions, lawyers who litigated state cases, were very few and far between. It was not a very sexy practice of law. People who argue before the Supreme Court, wow, that's a lot of prestige. And so there's not been a lot of attention paid on state courts until recently, a few years ago. The US Supreme Court said, why don't you guys go to your states? So this is one of the things that I want us to think about, is going into states. It allows us to have more creativity. It allows us to actually have more rigid protections. Every single state constitution actually has a right to vote in it, I believe, except one, but I can't remember the one right now. But it actually says you have the right to vote. So we should be thinking strongly about challenging restrictions under our state laws. But how many of you know your state law? We all read the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. We know what Congress is not doing. We know what they're thinking about. But what is our legislature doing? If we were paying closer attention to that, we'd have a better sense about when our rules are violating our rights. Yes, please.
Well, state courts are becoming increasingly politicized themselves. So on the one hand, it would appear as if these laws are as at risk in the states as they are with the Supreme Court in Washington. And a question is, cannot rulings by state Supreme Courts be then pursued in federal court after having been made?
Yes. If you take your claim through your state process and your state Supreme Court rules in a particular way, in a certain subset of cases, you can then appeal that decision to the US Supreme Court. And you can also bring a parallel case in a federal court if you wanted. There's lots of rules about this. And I'll invite you all to consider coming to law school and getting a law degree. Maybe not all of you, because I understand for some of you, that's 3 years that you don't want to spend time doing. But I see some young people in the crowd, and maybe you could consider law school. And part of this is understanding that federal courts are supposed to defer to state courts when they are interpreting their own law. There's actual rules and canons and a long list of precedents about this. There are some very notable exceptions that really dig at the core of that value, like Bush versus Gore, for example, where the state Supreme Court of Florida interpreted the state constitution, and then the federal court, the US Supreme Court, overturned them. But I would not encourage us to think about that exception as swallowing the rule. In hundreds or thousands of cases, federal courts say, if there's a state case going on, we're going to keep our hands off of the pot, even though it's technically possible they could get involved. And maybe we can come back and talk about the politicization of courts and state courts at the end when we get there to talk about that. Okay. What about public policy? Why are we worried about lawyers? Lawyers are reactive. Lawyers only get involved after something's happened. That's one of the sad truths that I have to tell law students. You can't file a lawsuit until you've been injured, or the court will say you have no standing. So you have to get hurt first. Why are we waiting for people to get hurt to vindicate our rights? Why not just go and elect people who will preserve these rights in a more robust way? Well, it's not a really pretty picture right now. I'm going to just talk about one kind of pattern that we saw recently. Here's Milwaukee County in Wisconsin. On the left is all of the polling places that the county uses in their, quote, normal elections. And the color coding is basically shows you the demographics of the people who vote in those polling places. On the left, you see these light blue circles, and that's generally speaking where white people vote, or a population that's more white. The darker that the dot gets, the less white the population is. So up in the city of Milwaukee, you'll see a lot of polling places where the voting population is 80, sometimes 90% African American. Then COVID hit, and we couldn't open as many polling places for a whole number of reasons, a lot of which had to do with poll workers who were sick. And so we had to constrict the number of polling places that we were going to operate for voters to come. And this is the map on the right. And you can see that more polling places closed in communities of color than in whiter communities. That's not the most extreme. It's not like we closed all of the voting booths in Milwaukee, the city, and kept all of the voting booths open elsewhere. But there was a huge pattern about where we target our resources when things get tight, where we pull money from, where we pull resources from when we don't have an unlimited pie. And over time, we're now 235 years in, I mentioned, into this American experiment. Over and over and over and over again, a pattern has emerged that's as predictable as anything else in the United States. When we withdraw resources, it comes from communities of color first, and communities that already lack those resources. We don't take that opportunity to readjust and say, you know what, we're doing pretty well. If we live out in the suburbs of this county, we're going to require those voters who have means to drive into the city, but let's maintain those city polling places. Instead, we say, well, we all kind of live out here and it's comfortable. And those people, again, depending on where we live and what we look like, what our history is, it's easy to otherize. And we've seen a pattern. Here's what happened in a far wider county, Dane County in Wisconsin. On the left was all the polling places that existed before COVID. And here's all the polling places that existed after. Hardly any change at all in an extremely white county. This, I think, is where, I think Dane County is where the University of Wisconsin is, which is probably that blue dot, Madison. Okay, this is depressing. I'm going to say from my own perspective. To me, it suggests that leaning on our leaders to always do the right thing and to promote equality and voting rights isn't going to serve us well in every case. Here's a map that shows two things. All of the counties that have color are the 10% of counties that are the most vulnerable for COVID deaths in 2020. based on their underlying health status and the number of people who contracted COVID and the number of deaths that they were seeing. So this were the 10% most vulnerable counties, about 300, because we have 3,000 plus counties in the United States. Then they're color coded by what kind of voting rules were available to them during COVID, whether or not basically states recognize that if you show up to a polling place, you might contract COVID and you actually literally might die. This wasn't a rhetorical political ad, vote for the other side and your life's on the line. No, this was if you show up to vote, your life could be put on the line. And in many places, these red counties, there was no possibility that you could submit a ballot by mail based on your fear of contracting COVID or your underlying health conditions. Whereas in these other states, the orange counties, you could mail in vote if you requested it. The yellow counties were places where you could mail in a ballot just by right. It was made available to you. But we're seeing certain places. Those of you who know about Texas politics might know something about the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and the demographics. It's poorer than most of the state. It's less white. There's a lot of Hispanic population in that part of the state. It was a place of the state that was highly vulnerable to COVID death. And yet when there was a plea made to allow mail-in voting for people because of sickness or because of COVID and this extreme change in our society, there was no accommodation made. Whereas there were accommodations made for other constituencies. I think I have a map about this. Here are these counties that have the lines on them. These hatched marks are the counties that are the most vulnerable for COVID death. And this is the way that people voted in the 2018 election. And we know that Republicans control the state house and they're making a determination about who they want to show up to vote and who they're going to help come to the polling place. And certainly we have no incentive for our parties now to allow people who they don't think are going to vote for them to get access to the ballot. Yes. Now, David, our esteemed kind of host today, who runs the Office of Outreach and Engagement very well, I should add, doing amazing work, mentioned that part of the purpose of CU on the Weekend is for us to come and talk about our research. So this is work that I've done with public health scholars to identify the most vulnerable places in the country based on underlying health data. And what are the components that are driving that? And in many places, it's the race of the population, the demographics in that way. And, you know, I'll just say, like, for example, look at, I can't reach quite up there, but look at this blue county right here in the middle. Not particularly a place that, it's not in the top 10 most vulnerable counties. It's dark blue because the most important driver of COVID risk was age, if you were over 65 or not. But all the counties that surround it were counties that saw high non-white populations, and that non-white population status is what drove the underlying health conditions. Well, watch that county, and what's unique about that county? Well, it's a Republican county. And so it had the opportunity, because of people being over 65, to submit an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot, whereas other counties couldn't. So is this a story about race? It could be. Is this a story about politics? Definitely. But I want you to think about what kind of incentives that we give our parties to act responsibly. We tell our parties, win. That's what we told them. You win, you can pull those levers of government all you want. What if you cheat to win? You still get to pull those levers of government. You still get to pass laws. If we find out later that you cheated and the court said, oh my gosh, you were engaged in fraud, and maybe we even remove you from office for some reason, what about all those laws that you voted for 5 years? We don't invalidate them. There's really not incentive. You can, as long as you can get into office, you can start to entrench whatever it is that you view the world and all the power that you have, for as long as you can get away with it. And so that's a problem. It's another reason why I think our political process is broken, is we don't have any incentives for our parties to behave responsibly. They're not state institutions, they're private organizations. And our government doesn't regulate private organizations very well. We allow private organizations to be discriminatory in certain ways. They can decide who their members are or aren't if it's a private organization. And political parties are private organizations who are told, if you win, you can have power. And that's it. Let's look at that. One more step about this, about what our political campaigns are doing. This is a little bit more research that I have. Then I'll turn our attention to some path forward, and then we can have a discussion. There's been a persistent gap, an income gap in turnout in voting since the 70s. Here's whatever, 5 elections, we're not going back that far. But it's about 30% turnout difference between people in the poorest parts of our country and people in the richest zip codes and people who have the most money in our country. It is persistent, which means we've tried lots of different reforms, and those reforms haven't really worked. What might be driving this? Well, it could be voter registration is driving this. That's one additional step that's costly. So you can see on the left, if you just look at the percent of people who turn out among the total population, there's a 30% gap from the poorest 20% of our population and the richest 20% of our population. Okay, well, what about the people who are registered to vote? Well, it may not surprise you that there's a gap between people who have the means to register to vote and the people who don't have the means to register to vote. So that gap persists. What about on the right? Now that everybody's registered, we might expect that voting rights will turn out in equal numbers because we've overcome one big hurdle. And yet we continue to see turnout numbers 20% different between our poorest and our wealthiest.
And I'm sorry, Doug, I'm going to interrupt more. It's folks are saying that when you speak nearer to the microphone on your lapel, they can hear everything, but sometimes when you speak away from that side of your chest, it drops.
Let's try this.
So just, I think, to be aware, and folks will be able to. And thanks to Carl for bringing that to our attention, that is still happening. Thanks for the patience of everyone who's in the room.
No, I appreciate that. This is, I'm also, the poor person who's running the camera has to follow me on the stage. I kind of want to run over here. Sorry, Annabelle. And I'll talk over here, but I appreciate you at least keeping me on the screen for the people watching. You're doing a fantastic job. I'm going to stand and I'm going to walk back. I apologize. This is not working. So I'm just going to stand at the podium here, which will make the job easier. All right. Here's a figure that's going to take a minute to set up. But I think this figure tells the whole story. This is data from a private company called Catalyst. They have been, some of you may be familiar with this firm. There's other firms. Target Smart is a firm that exists. Cambridge Analytica, which went bankrupt and was involved early in some Republican politics, was engaged in data like this. What do these firms do? Well, your voter record is public. We don't know who you voted for, of course, because the ballot is secret, but we know if you turned out to vote, and that's a public record. And we know which elections you turned out to vote in. So these firms, who are very creative, have gone to all the states and they've scraped all of that data. So for every single one of us, they know, oh, Doug Spencer voted in 2000 for the first time. That was my first election. I was 21, 22. And oh, he didn't vote in 2004. Oh, shame on him. I wonder why that's the case. But he voted in every other presidential election and in the last 10 years, every election, including school board. So he's a real active voter. But here's someone else that's not active. They know all that stuff about us, which may not be so bad. But they've taken that information and they've merged it with giant consumer databases. For example, every time you swipe your credit card, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they know your name and they know what you bought. And that's stored in a big database. And that's now been merged. So now these private companies, they know things like, generally speaking, people who vote for Democrats, they like to use the old Apple computer. But people who generally vote for Republicans, they're dinosaurs. They use the PC. They know if you traveled abroad last year because they know if you bought tickets, international travel. They know if you have pets because they see whether you've shopped at Petco and bought food. They know all sorts of things about us, and they've matched it to the voter record. Before we all build our tin hats, which we can do after we leave this room, I don't want to focus on the scariness of that very fact, but oh my gosh, it feels very scary to me. But now what they do is they sell that data to campaigns, and they use all that information to predict how each of us is going to vote. And they have a pretty good record because they use polls and they ask people like me, who did you vote for when you voted in that election? And I tell them. And then they say, oh, here's some characteristics about him that made him vote in these particular ways. Who are other people that look like Doug Spencer? Maybe they voted similarly, and they build a model that predicts how you're going to vote. Every single one of these pixels is a voter in Ohio in 2004. Yes, in the front row.
But can't they know that easily by looking at which primary you participated in? Because you participated in the Republican or the Democratic primary, and if they have that information for the primary, they would know.
So
without
for
going on
some
other-
people, yes. So if for some of us, they have very, very high confidence that you're Republican or Democrat, then because of you voted in a primary, for example. As it turns out, very few people vote in a primary, right? We may have 20% of eligible voters, which is 5% of the population. So in order to get a model of every single person, they're using some statistics and matching, and they have a prediction. And then they sell that to you. So if you want to run for president of the United States, like John Kerry did, and you want access to this data for every single voter, and you're going to get a score from 0 to 100. 0 on this list means this voter is definitely going to vote for Republican. And 100 on this score says this person's definitely going to vote for a Democrat. And there are some people that we don't quite know. People who voted well, they voted for George W. Bush in 2000, but they voted for Obama in 2008. Then they abstained in 2016. What do you think they're going to do next time? Okay, so they may fall in the middle. Then they also can tell you from 0, this person is just probably not going to turn out because we haven't seen them turn out in prior elections, to we know this person is going to turn out with 100% certainty. And we know this about every person. Every single person that is in the database has a score, or in this case, 2 scores. John Kerry did not have access to this information because this didn't exist yet. This is what made Obama's campaign so successful. He was the campaign that built a digital platform using data, microtargeting it's called. In the past, we would know basically every precinct about how many votes came in for Republicans or Democrats. So if you're a Democratic voter, you're like, well, I better go to Boulder County. It seems pretty blue. But you're probably going to knock on the doors of some Republicans here, and that's going to force them to know what you believe, and it's going to force you to talk to them. Now, if you work for a presidential candidate, you take your smartphone, you walk down the street, and it says, don't knock on that house, don't knock on that house. Oh, you should knock on that house. And it tells you exactly where to go. We're not talking to each other anymore. I only hear people who knock on my door who believe the things that I believe, that a computer told them. And they're only seeing people, and we have a warped view about what people think. Well, we can see that with the lack of data, John Kerry had a pretty good idea who were Democrats. So the Democratic Party had a big database of people, and they gave it to him. And he's like, I know that these people are Democrats. I'm going to contact all of them. Green means I've contacted them more times, 10, 15, 20 times. Red means I didn't talk to them at all. And then orange and yellow somewhere in the middle. So we can see he spent all of his resources talking to Democrats, even the ones who weren't going to turn out. He didn't know that. He didn't have this data. This is a reconstruction, but I'm going to show you what it looks like now that the campaigns have this data. Yes, here in the middle, if there's a
and
microphone.
before we get to that, I'm sorry, someone's been waiting online with the question. Is there a way we can learn our own scores? And then we'll go to the question.
That's a great question. No, these are private companies.
And the question was, is there a way we can learn our own scores in this kind of a database?
Yeah, which dot are you? If you run for office, or if you have a whole bunch of money, then you could buy this data set. It's really expensive. For research purposes, I purchased a 1% sample of the entire country. So I got 3 million observations. And because I was trying to figure out, for a graph I'm going to show you from some research I did, who these people are that are being talked to and not talked to. And unfortunately, I was kind of hoping maybe my name would be in that list, and it wasn't. But for a 1% sample, and I wasn't doing it for political purposes, so they weren't charging me top dollar. I think it cost me $20,000. Luckily there were granting agencies, and I wrote this project with 2 other professors who were at universities that had more money than I did, and we pooled our resources and bought this. So in theory, yes, you're in a database, but it's owned by these companies, and they've monetized it, and they're making a lot of money off of this. Yes, a question.
I'd like to make a comment in that I have canvassed in prior elections and doing it now. And you get Democratic people that have said they're Democrats and unaffiliated. So, and I think right now the unaffiliated is a big percentage.
It's a big percentage.
Yeah, so it's not just, you're just not just talking.
That's right. So now that we have this data, you can, John Kerry didn't have this. So let's see what Barack Obama did in 2012. He had this data. This is his reelection campaign. Same state, every pixel is going to be a person. It's not the same pattern. This doesn't work. I don't know why I'm doing that. All right, first of all, it's more organized. We've sorted people into buckets. We know what they're going to do. Okay, he mobilized his supporters, just like John Kerry did. He knows who Democrats are. He spent a lot of time making sure they showed up to vote. But, and remind me your name, I'm sorry, we met earlier, and Karen. Karen points out there's a lot of reason to spend time trying to persuade people who might be unaffiliated in the middle. And Obama's campaign was trying to do that. So we see actual strategies that we talk about in political strategy classes and campaigns. Mobilization, persuasion. What else do we see? Obama didn't talk to like 10% of people at all. And these weren't a random subset of people, right? John Kerry, the people that he didn't talk to were kind of spread around. He was doing his best given the data that he had. But now that we can micro-target down to the person, we can ignore huge swaths of this country who we don't think are going to turn out. Which of course just means they're not going to turn out because we didn't ask them to turn out. And why didn't we ask them to turn out? Well, they didn't turn out last time, so we're pretty sure they won't turn out this time. So instead of educating people and changing their lives and saying, be a part of our society, why didn't you turn out? What made you abstain for the last decade? Why do you feel like an outsider? Let's bring you into our community. We need you. You're an American, but we want you to be a part of what we're doing. And instead, we say, well, okay, we're just writing you off. And being written off is a big problem that's contributed to our broken political process. People feel like they've been written off. And the sad truth for us, and this is Obama's campaign. So this isn't even, if we're a room of mostly liberals, I'm presuming based on where we are, we can't even shake our fingers at the Republican Party. This was Obama, the hope, the bring people together candidate who basically said, oh, there's a bunch of you I'm just not going to talk to. And then a bunch of people in the United States say, wow, we really feel alienated. No one wants to talk to us. And well, they're right. A lot of people don't want to talk to them.
Well, there's a reason for not talking to them, because there's a limited amount of money that you have, and you're going to allocate it to the point that will be most productive.
Yes.
And the odds are better that somebody who has voted are going to turn out, and you'll get a better return on.
Yes. So to be charitable to the campaigns, I should say, we never told them to contact everybody. We told them to win. And we said, you're not going to have enough money to contact everybody, so you're going to have to make choices. And this is rational. In fact, it's very efficient. In fact, it makes me want to vote for Obama because he gets it. He's a good business person. He knows about incentives. Like, yeah, mobilize these people, persuade those people, ignore everybody else, and I can win. Oh, he's got a good business mind. Yes, it's very much rational for our campaigns to do that. That's the point. We haven't created incentives for our parties or our campaigns to behave in a way that promotes equality and participation. We've told them to win at all costs, and we're trying to limit the amount of money in politics. We're saying do it with limited resources, and we're seeing patterns that are completely predictable. This is just a diagnosis. Here's what we know. This is from the sample of this data that I found, and I just wanted to see on the income scale, among some other things. But this is from a paper that I published that shows with Bertrand. I'm not trying to minimize my co-author, but this amazing professor at the University of Virginia, that people who are predicted to be the lowest turnout are much more likely to be in the poorest category, 20% of our population, than they are to be in the richest. 20% of the population. This is that strip of red at the top of the Obama campaign for the whole country. This isn't just Ohio, and it's not just Democrats. It's everybody. Were you contacted or not? And for 2012, 2014, 2008, 2010, all the way back, all of these lines are kind of down in this direction, which means the less likely you are to turn out, the more poor that you are. And what that means is we have a government now that's not serving the needs of our poor, because the poor in our country have no political voice. And we're not going out of our way as at least political campaigns to reach out to them. In fact, we're completely ignoring them for completely predictable and maybe even expected reasons, because it's not efficient to contact them. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? I led you on a hook for an hour diagnosing a problem you already knew about. So that's not doing anybody any services. Maybe there's a few things here that you hadn't seen before. But what can we do about this? Well, one thing we can do if the system is so poorly broken is we can change the system. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Madison in 1789 in the midst of the ratification process of our US Constitution. And he lamented our Constitution, how hard it was to amend it. And he said, among other things, every constitution should expire at the end of 19 years. Now that seems very disruptive. But there's a little nugget of wisdom in there. Why don't we allow every generation the chance to define themselves and their political destiny? We're proud of the fact that we're allowing people who died 200 years ago to dictate the way that we live our lives. And there's something that's very stabilizing about that. There's something that's very reverent in a way about that. And the respect that we can pay to people who helped our country develop from nothing. But there could be something to be said about allowing each generation, now 19 years for Thomas Jefferson, instead of being our lives dictated by the dead, for us to contribute our own views as a society. Now, this isn't just pie in the sky ideas. There were some scholars who were interested in why our Constitution has endured for 200 years. And so they read every single constitution in the world that had ever been written from the 1787 to the present. And there were, I think, 300 something constitutions. And they coded them. Do they have a freedom of speech? Do they have an amendment process? Do they provide for X? Do they provide for Y? And they were curious. Let's look at all of them and decide what are the features that allowed a constitution to survive, and what are the features that made constitutions fall away quickly? That was the premise of their book, The Endurance of National Constitutions. And I'm going to have to leave it for another time to tell you what the specific things are that they found that made constitutions endure. What I want to tell you is that when they read every single constitution, the world's most amazing coincidence you could have ever predicted, they found that the life expectancy of the constitutions are 19 years. Like unbelievable. But there is something we could say about our natural state of the world, where there's some clamoring for every generation to get a say in their political destiny. And we may not need to throw our Constitution in the garbage. In fact, I think we're so quick these days to throw things away that we just think are useless instead of learning from them. But we could amend the Constitution. We could add an amendment that says voting is a fundamental right. Like, remember how I said voting wasn't quite as protected as gun rights and religious rights? Well, the thing I didn't tell you is that gun rights and religious rights are in the Constitution and voting rights isn't. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised that Alito came to that conclusion. Why don't we amend the Constitution and say voting is part of our political destiny? Everybody together. We can change our system in a way that could improve the path that we're on.
So a question from Deborah online on that point. Was that a minority view in Jefferson's time? It definitely conflicts with the position of originalists.
It was definitely a minority view. I don't know enough about the historical patterns to talk about how many people Thomas Jefferson was able to get on his side, but there were robust debates about whether the Constitution should have a deadline in it. This will last for 50 years and then it will self-destruct like a James Bond movie or a Mission Impossible document. They didn't want to do that. And then the question was, are we going to allow the amendment process to be easy or not? And as we know, it's so difficult to amend our Constitution, which just then, unfortunately, means either it breaks because it doesn't match our times, or we find ways around it. And the way we found around it in our country is to allow our Supreme Court to make stuff up to kind of fill in the gaps. And when they make stuff up that makes you feel good, you're like, yeah, I like that. When they make stuff up that makes you feel bad, you get upset. And that's not, that's how we've dealt with it, but it's led to some problems. But we could amend the Constitution. We could constitutionalize our political parties. That exists in parts of the world. Now, instead of having a political party that's a private organization that can do whatever it wants, if the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were were government institutions or in our Constitution, guess what they would have to do? Abide by the Constitution, which means they'd have to treat everybody equally. They couldn't ignore you based on the color of your skin. They couldn't treat you poorly because you're poor in ways that we don't allow our government to do. And so there's ways maybe we could think about changing the Constitution to affect parties. I don't know that that's the right answer, but there are ways for us to change our system altogether if we think that it's so completely broken. We can also work within the system, or what I'm going to call this working the system. Before I talk about what's on the screen, I'll mention our Congress is debating the Electoral Count Act. They might be able to shore up an attempted insurrection/coup like we saw on January 6th, where people are trying to take over the government outside of an election. So those rules will change. That's within the system. We had a conversation before about state constitutions. Here's a completely radical thing that happened last week that I would be surprised if people saw in the news, even though it's completely radical. The state Supreme Court in North Carolina struck down a state constitutional amendment. They said it didn't get enough votes in the state legislature in 2018 when it was put before the voters. But if you look back at the legislative record, you'd say, yeah, it got enough votes. They held a vote in the state legislature and more people voted for it than didn't. And the state Supreme Court said, you know what happened though? Funny thing, in 2016, we held that the districts that were drawn in our state were racially gerrymandered. And all of the people who got elected from those racially gerrymandered districts, who then came to our state house, passed a constitutional amendment that made it hard for people to vote based on their race, thereby entrenching the restrictions against the very people who had been carved out of the voting process to begin with. And they just wagged their finger and said, no way. If you were elected in a district that was considered to be unconstitutional, we're not going to allow you to pull the levers of government. Your vote didn't count. And it didn't count in this one way, just if you were trying to amend the Constitution and if you were amending it in a way to entrench power against the people that had been carved out in redistricting. But that, like I said, is a radical opinion. Radical because we've never seen it before. Is it radical as a theory that if you were elected unconstitutionally, you shouldn't be able to govern the Constitution? No, I think that's a debatable proposition. And people are going to disagree. I guarantee you people will disagree, but I think there's a reasonable debate to be had about that. It feels very undemocratic for a judge to overturn something that was voted on by people who were elected. But if we just allow people to pass laws, even if they've been elected in nefarious systems without any consequence, why would we expect anything different? So that's another path forward. I want to tell you about Latasha Holloway. Latasha Holloway, you've never heard of her. She's an ordinary African-American woman who lives in Virginia Beach, Virginia. She's a single mom. She's raising 6, maybe 7 kids. And she felt ostracized in her community. She recognized something about her city. The city of Virginia Beach has been on the books, has existed as an entity for 55 years. They have a city council that has 11 members. The city population of Virginia Beach is pretty diverse. There's military, it's close to North Carolina, it's in the South. 30, I should have got this number before I came here, but 30-something% of the population is non-white. 55-year city's history, 11 members of the city council, never a person of color, with a population that was 30%. And she said, something smells to me. What did she do? She went to the courthouse. She didn't call a lawyer. She went to the courthouse. She says, how do I file a lawsuit? And they said, here's a form. You just fill it out, tell us what you think is wrong. And she wrote on the form, the political system in my city is broken, and signed her name and filed a lawsuit. And this lawsuit, one of the beauties about American litigation, we get made fun of so much for being litigious. Oh, I got some hot coffee at McDonald's and it spilled on my lap, so I sued somebody, and people laugh. Oh, you silly Americans. Of course we sued somebody. That's how we vindicate our rights in a peaceful way. If I couldn't file a lawsuit and get restitution for harm, then maybe I'll go vandalize the McDonald's to get them back. We have a system where you can be heard, you can tell your story. Latasha Holloway ended up standing before a federal judge in a federal courthouse in Virginia and testifying, I think my city politics are broken. Now, she had help. Once this lawsuit was, people noticed this lawsuit, lawyers did come and attach themselves to that case. And in full disclosure, I was involved in this case as their expert witness in talking about voting patterns in the city of Virginia Beach. And last year, a federal judge looked at Latasha Holloway in the eyes and said, you were right. This system where we elect our city council at large means that the 58% of the white population gets to elect all 11 seats, and it has left you out and you have not had a voice. And said that cannot stand. And we have an order here from a United States federal judge, Eastern District of Virginia. It's declared that Virginia Beach's at-large election is illegal and cannot be enforced in future elections. She did this on her own. So on the one hand, I think that litigation can be a powerful tool, whether it's in a state court, even today with Samuel Alito sitting on the bench and saying there are inconveniences, there are powerful remedies to be had in federal court. But Latasha Holloway herself did something hard, really hard. When I exercise, the people that are telling me what to do always say, you can do hard things, because it hurts to exercise. I don't like lifting weights. And it hurts to do this too. It's not easy. It's uncomfortable to challenge the system. She's very vulnerable, but she's a very amazing woman. And I challenge all of us to be as brave and as creative and as ambitious as she was. If we can't change the system or work the system, I would say there are opportunities for us to work around the system. And we've had this in the spirit of the United States for as long as we've had a country, of people protesting, community organizing, social movements. The culmination we have of this Dobbs case that has overturned Roe v. Wade is the culmination of a decades-long era of protest. In the last 2 years, the thoughts about police reform and Black Lives Matter was not from the law, it wasn't from politicians, it was from communities. There are ways for us to get involved as communities. The other ways that I think, aside from protest, the protest is just nice because it's a picture with vibrant colors. But what I want you to think about is opportunities to support private firms that are filling in the gaps that our social institutions just never will. We don't tend to think about that. We think, well, there's government or there's private business. No, our government's trying its very best. And as it falters, there are nonprofit organizations. The League of Women's Voters out here doing great work, saying, well, our government's not registering people to vote. Maybe we should get together and mobilize people to vote. There are firms and nonprofits doing work that we should learn about, that you should support, that you should watch their behavior. Are they giving money to people who infiltrated the Capitol on January 6th? Maybe I don't want to give them my business. Maybe I'll think about the democratic values they espouse as much as I do the environmental positions they espouse, or their history of racism. Making that a core part of your decision-making about supporting firms as a way around the system in that way. A question.
So we have a number of questions that have come in online, and about 10 minutes or so left of the discussion. We don't want to privilege just because folks can submit things online, since you all who are in the audience have been holding this. So maybe we can take something from the in-person audience, and then we'll take an online question.
Gretchen, you were standing here. Was there a hand? Sorry, I didn't even see your hand, so I apologize. If you'll wait for the microphone again. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've heard so many people talk about voting rights, and that's obviously important, as is making sure that your vote is counted accurately, but a focus on proportional representation and making sure that your vote makes a difference is incredibly important. You know, voters in Oklahoma, in Nebraska and so on, they don't have any Democratic representatives in Congress. Boulder County, how many Republicans are in power? Massachusetts, none. So giving people hope that their vote will actually move the needle and have someone to represent them, I think is incredibly important. And I just want to say that the League of Women Voters of Boulder County is working on proportional representation in Boulder City Council and in other councils in Boulder County, which I think is the most important thing to fix in our elections here locally.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and if you don't mind, I'll share something that you told me before the meeting, which is what can be powerful about proportional representation is if you're showing up to vote and you don't even have any expectation that the government's going to reflect your will in any way, but you still show up because it's your duty. How depressing is that? But if there's a chance, and maybe it's proportional representation, yeah, I'm not, my vote, if I'm a Republican in Boulder County and I'm voting for city council, I'm never going to be in charge of that city council. But if there were one person up there who were speaking the language that I spoke and who was bringing up in the room the things that I cared about, I would just feel much more empowered. I agree with you. And I think so that these kinds of systems can make a difference.
Yeah, and so on the ground, there used to be an HR 4000, the Fair Representation Act, that would have multi-member districts for Congress and allow us to fix that at the national level. And I think it also would really get people campaigning more broadly instead of only picking on certain geographical areas. I think it'd be a big difference and help people, you know, feel represented, which makes them less angry. And I think anger has driven a lot of the problems.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes,
Great.
online.
So Michael asks, can you speak to the proliferation of election deniers who cast doubt on the very system itself?
There's a lot of attention paid to election deniers after 2020, but the seeds have been sown for a long time. If you remember a debate between Barack Obama and John McCain in 2008, John McCain criticized this community organizing group, Acorn, said they were perpetuating, quote, the biggest fraud in the history of our country. It was kind of a Trumpian statement at the time. We hadn't heard politicians talk like that. And so there have been people actually talking about and sowing the seeds for this for a long time. What would I say about them? I guess one of the things that I would point people would be to read a state Supreme Court opinion out of the Missouri State Supreme Court, who had to evaluate a voter ID law in 2006. And they said, we don't accept as the state's interest, it's the state's reason for passing this law, that the election is being run in such a poor way, because that's a manipulated fantasy. You can manipulate people to think that the election is stolen and then justify canceling their vote. And they said, we're not going to engage in that game. Unfortunately, that the US Supreme Court took a different tack in 2008, in this case, Crawford versus Marion County in Indiana, where they said, yeah, if you're worried about fraud, then you can institute all sorts of restrictions on voting, which I think accelerated this idea. And so I think there's just a recognition that this was foreseeable. I think there's a recognition it's been abetted by, I'm looking at David who gave me the question, but I should look at the camera, which is the person who brought this in. But it's been abetted by the law in accepting the fact that concerns about fraud without any evidence would justify adding restrictions on voting. If you show up to court and you have evidence that an election is fraudulent, then the courts are very happy to overturn that election or call for a new election. If you don't have any evidence, then I think courts should not permit those cases to go forward, because then it allows people to build a whole infrastructure about that. Maybe it's worth stating publicly for the record, even though nobody cares what I think, but the 2020 election, Joe Biden won that election. I guess it's helpful for people to hear that sometimes, based on the rules that we had. Did that mean more people in America preferred him? I don't know, but the people who turned out sure did. And if you think that the people who didn't turn out had different preferences, then we should try to get more people to turn out. And I will also note this in terms of reforms going forward, because that's part of the question. 2020 had the highest turnout in our country for a presidential race since 1908. So 115-year high turnout in terms of the percent of the eligible population. Let me just note that in 1908, the percent of the eligible population was really small, didn't include women. And now in 2020, we include 50% of the population that was completely excluded, and we still had higher turnout. It was the highest turnout election ever. And let's, it's hard for us, but let's put Donald Trump in a closet for a minute because he did lose. But the 2020 election was a Republican election. Republicans won that election in every state house all over the country. So this idea that encouraging more people to vote is going to help Democrats, I hope the 2020 election threw some cold water on that, so that at least going forward, there can be some bipartisan support for more voter engagement. It's not just a Democratic ploy. We saw the biggest turnout in 100 years, and Republicans won all over the state. Republicans won in the state of Colorado, and we have mail-in voting and a very high turnout and a very representative sample of voters compared to other states. And Lauren Boebert was elected from Colorado, and she's not the most mainstream Republican that you would think of a Republican 10 years ago. So these systems haven't prevented Republicans from succeeding, which I state just as a hopeful measure that there can be space for reform. Republicans can come on the table for this.
Perhaps we could get one or two more questions. I'm wondering if anyone in the back of the room up above has a question that you've been holding. At the front of the back.
So what would you say to people who don't believe that you can change our system from the inside? And what are some actions, like a path forward for those people in getting equal representation and changing the government as a whole?
I certainly would think that it's easier to change our system from the inside. So if you have hopes for change, I would encourage you to run for office someday. And that's not the question you asked, but why are you shaking your head so vigorously? Because our process is so broken. Why would you want to spend your time doing that? And this is a problem. We're in a vicious cycle. Respectable, good people look at Congress and say, do I want to go there and try to solve problems when what will get me the most notoriety or the most effect is tweeting? I'll just tweet from my house. And then a lot of people that probably the people we need the most are turning those opportunities down, which leaves space for others who may have different ideas in mind. And I don't want to cast aspersions on any individual people, but I recognize your aversion to that. When I was in high school, if somebody said run for office, I'd say, oh gosh, that's really flattering that you think that I would have such virtue and that people would like me so much I could do that. It was seen as a compliment to be a politician, to be told that you could run for office someday. Wow, people respect you. And I respect you for being here and asking that question, if I'm being honest. And so, but you're telling me you're not going to run, so I can't vote for you. But you have passion and you want to make a difference. How do we, I'm not looking for votes, I'm looking for change. How do we affect change? I think, I'm biased, but I was invited to come and talk about my perspective. So you'll get my perspective. I think one of the ways that we can change our country is through the law. I study law. I went into the practice of law for this reason. The society's messed up. Politics are messed up. And the law is not a perfect salve for our problems, but the law is rigorous with some notable exceptions, but by and large, lawyers behaved responsibly during the 2020 election. And I think learning about the law, writing reforms or holding people accountable and power through law can be helpful. Now, you may say the law is inside the system. And so becoming a lawyer is just joining the system and becoming complicit. In that case, my personal short experience, I'm 43 years old. I've seen the most impact from people who organize their neighborhoods and their communities to action and who pay attention to things that really matter. So the first thing I would say, if you want to affect change, is to find a problem that you actually, it's not a problem that Fox News is talking about. It's not a problem that Rachel Maddow tells you to think about. It's a problem in your community. If you're a Boulder student, maybe there's something about this university that bothers you. Then let's change this university's policies. Maybe it's something about your neighborhood and the city's not listening to you. If you bite off a reform that is local and will affect your actual life, not just make you emotionally feel good because your candidate won or lost, and mobilize your friends to be active, you guys can change anything. And I 100% believe that. And Latasha Holloway changed it by herself. You get 30 people together or 40 people who say, this is what we're going to make happen. People will listen to you. The university will listen to you. The city will listen to you. And that is just a matter of making yourself loud about things that actually impact your life and not about things far away.
So
Yes.
Doug, since we're just about out of time, do you have any final remarks that you want to leave us with to close out?
Yeah, let me, and maybe it builds off this idea about why I think the law is so special. One, lawyers get a lot of grief for being arrogant and self-righteous. Some of you are lawyers in the room, and maybe you'll giggle about that. Lawyers are some of the most intellectually humble people that we have in our society. When you come to law school, the first thing we teach you how to do is to poke holes in your own argument and to find the most empathetic, creative, and genuine support for the people who disagree with you. We know how to go to war with people, but not turn the other side into the enemy because we practice it. And not all of you are going to go to law school. And some of you might think that I'm just being Pollyanna-ish, but I think it's a real skill to be able to disagree without being disagreeable and to be able to really tell somebody you're wrong, but I understand why you would have that position. And I understand why you're saying that because of your experience. And we've trained people to do that. And I think there's lessons to be learned about that. I also would just say, I think there's space for pluralism in our politics. Pluralism just means there's a lot of different ideas and we're going to take turns being in charge. And I asked my Republican friends who supported Donald Trump, how many more terms do you want Donald Trump to be in office? And they said, forever. And I said, well, you're going to have to readjust your expectations. And not just because Donald Trump is old and not going to have eternal life, but just if we could grasp in our mind that between today and the day that all of us meet our maker, Democrats are going to control government about half the time, and Republicans are going to control government about half the time. That simple acceptance, I think, would make a big difference. There are multiple views, and we have to accept that other people are going to pull those levers of power at different times. And hopefully we feel like we got a chance to pull those levers at some point in our life. And hopefully we don't feel that the other people's entire purpose of being in power is to own us, own the libs, own the Trumpers. It can't be about that. So just bringing this to what lawyers are doing, lawyers are changing the system. We're clamoring for amending the Constitution. Lawyers are working within the system, as Latasha Holloway's story shows, to help her. And lawyers are helping to navigate and work around the system and build hope. And this mental exercise about going to war without turning people into the enemy. It's just a matter of practice. Talk to people and then don't allow yourself to get mad. And I think we get enough people to do that. We can make a difference. It's going to take more of the people that are in this room, though. So we can all practice by going and finding 5 people and kind of sharing that message. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Doug. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this and sharing your expertise and your important work with our audience today, which we did have over 100 people online today viewing the lecture. So thanks to everyone who attended there and for your excellent questions. To those of you who took the time to show up, we really are grateful to have this intellectual community convening here again. And we hope you'll join us again in the future. I have a couple logistical things that I will say to wrap us up. So I wanted to especially appreciate Nick Honeycutt for being here today. He's sitting there in his CU Boulder shirt. Nick is actually moving on to another job. We're going to miss him terribly. But he agreed to help us with tech for this event today. And thanks to all the staff of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, Annabelle for wrangling the camera, and others for wrangling the microphones. Gretchen Minikheim in particular has been integral to the creation of this fall series. So this is the first of the fall series, which I just mentioned. We hope you will join us on October 22nd when Professor Lori Peak, who is director of CU Boulder's internationally recognized Natural Hazard Center, she'll be presenting a talk in this room titled, "What Do You Do When the Earth Shakes? Children, Adults, and Generational Gaps in Protective Action Behaviors." Professor Peak's presentation, as I mentioned, will be in this room, and immediately following that presentation, there will be a showcase in the space right outside these doors, featuring community engaged scholarship that's focused on climate change from across disciplines here at CU Boulder. So those who stay for the showcase on October 22nd can enjoy light refreshments and speak with faculty and staff members about their work with communities in Colorado and beyond. So, and we're also presenting that lecture, I should mention, with CU Boulder's Research and Innovation Office, referred to often as RIO, as part of their annual Research and Innovation Week. There are other events along those lines that'll be happening across campus. I recommend you all check out what's going on that week on campus. It's going to be really cool. All right, so lastly, and here's a technical thing, if the technical thing is working, Gretchen. So we really would love to get feedback from you all on this event to help us improve how we do these events going down the line in this hybrid format, as well as what you're interested in. We run around campus to identify really dynamic and interesting scholarship that's going on in order to present it for you also. If you're willing, we've got this new option here where you can use a smartphone to scan this QR code using your smartphone camera. And if you do that, it'll take you to a short online survey where you can give us some feedback on this event and let us know about what you'd like to see in the future. For those of you who aren't comfortable with or don't have the technology to do that, we do have paper surveys that are, Gretchen's standing over there by the door. You can grab one of those and fill it out before you leave and hand it to us before you go. That's the way we used to do it entirely. Isn't that wild? Folks online will receive an email, and you can click through to a survey from that email if you're one of our folks attending virtually. So the question is whether all lectures in the future will be in this building. Probably not all lectures. We locate things based on, sometimes it's the content, if there's performance involved or things like that, as well as what's available on campus. So we will be notifying you all via our email list in advance where lectures will be held. Our next lecture is in this room, as I mentioned, though, so that's a great question. Let's see, is there... We're really almost done. Thank you all for hanging out an extra minute. Yeah, that's all. We so appreciate you all giving us that feedback, as well as just being here. And we wish you the very best this weekend and beyond. Come see us on the weekend again sometime in the future. Thank you.